Greetings. I am recording this to an empty classroom because I plan to be out. So feel free to ask questions by email. I will be monitoring that while I'm away somewhat. And be back here next Tuesday, next week. So let's get right to it. I may have a speed problem, and by that I don't mean methamphetamine. It's actually not so much a problem, really. I just go fast. So if you're having trouble keeping up, you can actually slow me down by asking the next question or any question that you have. Sometimes, what you think is philosophy is not, and that's in quotes because it's actually not necessarily philosophy, but just kind of experience trying to be distilled into certain phrases. It's actually instructions in the form of what we call strategy memes. So strategy meme, a meme is basically like a virus of the mind. It's not necessarily an infection, not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be something that goes viral. And so, for example, when I approach a stop sign, now the law says that I'm supposed to stop, look 4 ways, and then proceed, come to a complete stop. But if there's no cops around, I and other drivers, if there's nobody in the intersection, might do what we call a California glide, making a right turn through the stop sign. So that's a strategy meme, right? Look to see if anybody's looking, then go do what you're going to do. So strategy memes in addiction, or as we're doing strength prevention, or not strength prevention, but prevention being the practice that makes you strong, often appears in the form of strategy memes. So skill building, sometimes the skill is a concept or a conceptual tool, as we will see later in some of our conception of how we think of addiction as a problem. And since this is an introduction to it, many of the things that you're seeing in this class understand many of the concepts are still younger than I am. Right? So, they're conceptual tools that lead to action or behavior. So, the original meme in substance abuse. So, understand that the field started in officially in America in 1956 when the American Medical Association determined that alcoholism was a disease, not a moral failure. So the concept out of medicine is self-medication. So it's an old thing from Hippocrates, going back to the Greeks and beyond the Greeks in Egypt. A doctor who treats themselves has a fool for a patient. Hence, self-medication is not good. So that's an example of a meme. And so in order to understand how memes work, if you think of them as viruses, you have to see what is the culture that generated them. What is at their core? What are the concepts? So this is a quasi-medical field, meaning that you don't have to be a doctor to practice it, but you do have to understand certain medical terminology and concepts. All right? So what happens with self-medication, you're in pain, so you take something to relieve the pain, or to forget the pain, or induce amnesia or forgetfulness because it was so horrible and violating, whatever it was that happened to you. So you take a drug or a combination of drugs to help you deal with the pain. All right? So that's a fairly basic concept that people can understand in terms of looking at self-medication. But, when we've now also talked about within athletics and other, like academic fields, performance-enhancing drugs. So, for example, when students will basically fake an ADHD diagnosis and then get diagnosed with Ritalin. Well, you don't actually have an attention deficit disorder. What you're doing is essentially taking an amphetamine so you can stay up late and study, or enhance your performance, or, yeah. So it becomes a question in terms of many people in the medical field whether this is a good practice. Performance-enhancing drugs, as an example, with steroids in athletics, and pain medications and things like that. Okay? Or they, whoever they is, think you have a problem, and their solution is to give you a drug that manages your behavior for you, and the assumption being here that you can't manage your behavior. So you're depressed, you're bipolar, basically then we give you a drug to artificially induce a certain state so that you can function in society. So basically, when we're talking about slowing your roll, right, the emphasis has been in our society, in American society, and the medical field under the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, which has basically happened and really grown really fast since World War II, is the emphasis is on pill taking rather than skill building. So, as an example, if I taught you, for example, a breathing technique, this is a mind or mood altering practice, as opposed to a pill. So count to 10 Zen goes like this. You breathe from your diaphragm, and when we actually do this work, for example, with homeless folks who, being homeless is essentially being in a state of constant trauma. And so deep breathing by itself is not so much a traumatic experience, but a very profound experience. So breathing from your diaphragm, your in-breath, the inhale, you count 1, out-breath, count 2, take another breath, and then try and count to 10 without having any thoughts other than the breath count. And if you have another thought, start over. Now, you can do this for initially up to 10 minutes or half an hour, but I would suggest, just so you actually try it for 10 minutes, but at least 3 to slow your breath down and to just simply become mindful of it, all right? So the idea is not so much to get to 10 without having a thought, it's actually to watch the process of your mind. So in yogic specific breathing with mantra, there is a thing called the 5-element breath, which you basically practice 5 times each. It's a Sufi practice with mantra and visualization. The idea is the earth breath, you inhale and exhale through the nose. The water breath, so you do that 5 times. The water breath, you inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, like a stream of water, and you visualize a stream of water. The fire breath, you inhale through the mouth and exhale through the nose. The air breath, inhale through the mouth and exhale through the mouth. And the ether breath, you inhale and exhale through the nose in such a way that the breath makes no sound at all, but is still full, deep, and slow. So breathing in this particular way for the time that it takes induces a state of consciousness that's different from when you started. So for example, within Kundalini Yoga, we practice long, deep breathing and or a breath called the breath of fire, which is inhaling and exhaling through the nose rapidly with a bellows motion. I'm not going to demonstrate that at the moment, but just to give you examples of some of the breath techniques that people use. So, pills are not skills. So the following technique, the previous techniques that I showed you came from cultures that are older than Western civilization, older than America, who, while they did have herbal drug technology, did not necessarily use that as their first line of defense for inducing mental health. Okay? Our society teaches you to self-medicate using substances, pills, or processes, because that is actually more profitable than teaching you how to be internally self-reliant. So if you had been taught, along with your potty training, to watch your breath, to slow your roll, as they say, or to slow yourself down, then you have the skill of self-soothing when you're under stress. So Buddha said, life is suffering. Yeshua said, you suffer because you love what deceives you. Acquire my peace within you. So this is Yeshua, or Isho for short, is the family name for the person you know historically as Jesus Christ. You suffer because you love what deceives you. So his peace is self-mastery within each breath, and knowledge, skills, and the wisdom to know the difference. For example, with the Serenity Prayer. So self-mastery is a skill that's internal, so that you learn how to regulate yourself without needing to take anything externally. So self-medication. You're in pain, so you take something to relieve it or forget the pain. So you take a drug or combinations of drugs, for example, to do that. Or if your thing is not so much drugs but retail therapy, you buy something to help you feel more in control or more powerful. Or they give you something. So it's not necessarily what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Suffering itself needs a context to be integrated. Okay? You need to see the source of your suffering and the cause and course of your suffering and the things you do to relieve or keep from reliving the pain of whatever it is you've been suffering. And what our society does is it teaches us essentially to go for quick relief rather than to eliminate the source of the stress if that's possible. So pills are not skills. Okay? Oftentimes, inside the pain is the key to relieving it. So the pain is an indicator of some kind of condition, and oftentimes within that pain, you have the key to relieving it. So, for example, one of the things that opiate addiction does for people, opiate addiction essentially, and we'll be learning this when we study specifically how drugs work in the body next week. But all opiates do is they don't actually stop the pain. They just change how you feel about the pain. And so in changing your feelings, you not only so much numb the pain, but also you numb other feelings, including joy and happiness as well. So one of the things that happens as a result is that you have what we call in counseling a flat affect, that is, you don't feel. In the case of incredible pain, where they steal your soul or life or attempt to kill or destroy you, or they've done that historically, and you begin to react in certain classic ways to that cultural destruction. So as an example, what that is, or in effect, you'll start doing something that attempts to destroy you. Now, where this is coming from, okay, you have to take your life back yourself, okay? They didn't destroy you, you still live. And I'll be explaining essentially what that is from another analysis shortly. Okay? So, as an example, this is going to hurt. So I'm just letting you know. Take a few deep breaths before we go on. In the paper this morning, they talked about a new study about that indicated that 1 in 10 adolescents had been involved with sexual assault, usually as a perpetrator. And this is including girls. So girls actually had perpetrated rape too, the older they got. Okay? Statistics are the stories of human suffering with the pain removed. So part of understanding the pain is understanding what is the individual story within that statistic. And here's the site. So 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. That's 14.8%. Completed rape, 2.8%. Attempted rape. 17 million American women have been the victims of attempted or completed rape. 9 out of every 10 rape victims were female this is from a statistic 10 years ago. Now, while some 80% of all victims are white, minorities are somewhat more likely to be attacked. Lifetime rate of rape, attempted rape for women by race. All women, 17%. White women, 17%. Black women, slightly higher, 18%. Asian Pacific Islander women, 6.8%. American, Indian, and Alaskan women, 34%. So in other words, if you're a Native woman, double. Mixed race women, 24%. And men, about 3% of American men, or 1 in 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. In 10 years ago, 1 in 10 rape victims were male. Nearly 3 million men in the U.S. have been victims of sexual assault or rape. Now, the reason I bring this up, it's a statistic. It's a painful statistic. It is quite likely that if it hasn't been experienced by you personally, someone you know has experienced this reality. So, for example, and many times people have this as children, and so when I basically talk about this in an addiction context, understanding addictive behavior, if people have been victimized or attacked or targeted, oftentimes they may or may not disclose that, and it will generate addiction problems, mental health issues later on in life, and society will focus on that without necessarily dealing with the source of the original problem. So with children, 15% of sexual assault and rape victims are under the age of 12. Nearly a third, 29%, are aged 12 to 17. 44% are under age 18. 80% are under age 30. 12 to 34 are basically the highest risk years in terms of sexual assault. Girls 16 and 19, 4 times more likely than the general population to be victims of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault. Usually, the statistics show it's not strangers, it's someone they know. 7% of girls in grades, let me adjust this so you can see it. 7% of girls in grades 5 to 8, that is essentially 10 to 13, and 12% of girls in grades 9 to 12 said they had been sexually abused. 3% of boys 5 to 8 in grades 5 to 8, and 5% of boys in grades 9 to 12 said that they had been sexually abused. So 95 local child protection service agencies identified 126,000 children were victims of either substantiated or indicated sexual abuse. So substantiated means it was proven in court of law, or basically the indicated means Yeah, it happened, but not necessarily proven. So of these, 75% were girls. Nearly 30% of child victims were between the age of 4 and 7. 93% of juvenile sexual assault victims know their attacker. 34% of attackers were family members. 58.7 were acquaintances. Only 7% of the perpetrators were strangers to the victim. Now, in these statistics, understand one of the things is not just the sexual assault, it's also part of what's driving this, and this is part of one of the keys of understanding addictive behavior, is that whether or not the addictive behavior, the self-medication is yours, you can be attacked by somebody under the influence. So a lot of these things are also happening under the influence. So for example, we have known in Oregon that 80% of many of the sexual abuse of children occurs under the influence of the drug methamphetamine because of side effects of that particular drug, particularly on men. So victims of sexual assault are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, 13 more times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 more times more likely to abuse drugs, 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So, I mean, if you look at these, all right? So, when you want to understand addictive behavior, understand that addictive behavior by itself is usually an indicator of some other problem. It's a symptom of some other problem, of what happened to you. So it's not so much, again, what was wrong with you or what is wrong with you, but it's what happened to you, and then how you learn to cope with it. So despite the proliferation or in other words, the spread of curriculum in grade school about safe touch and all that kind of stuff, we don't necessarily have the skill building to identify and prepare people for the reality that these kind of things might happen to them. We don't prepare them for that, and when it does happen to them, our helping systems are often overwhelmed, if not inadequate. Okay? So, what community knows how to heal this wound? What's the wound and what heals it? What community doesn't even know the wound exists or is in denial about it? So often what happens with conditions and disease processes and survivors is that if they talk about it at all, they talk about it with other people that have experienced the same thing, and often devise systems of self-help, if that's possible, if they're allowed to talk about it. Otherwise, what you have is a lot of people walking around with a great deal of pain who are masking those pain using the available skill. I'm not going to call it skill because I'm not going to confuse you by identifying that. Pills are not skills, okay? Part of the skill of dealing with this type of stuff is first acknowledging that it's happening. Right? So the questions. So typically when I present this, and I had mentioned this also came from the pros class, and the reason I'm basically bringing this up for you is not to train you to be a pro, but understand this is what you should understand if you actually approach a professional to try and deal with this particular issue. What I really found interesting is that 75% of women that go through drug and alcohol counseling have been sexually assaulted. You say that you don't have to be a woman to counsel those women. Question, do you feel that the counseling that these women receive is effective when counseled by a man? Now, the statistic that I used came from a local treatment agency that doesn't exist anymore. It It was the Sacred Heart Adolescent Recovery Program, which basically had it was an operation, probably treated about 13,000 individuals in the 13 some odd years that it was in existence. So it was an inpatient treatment center that I think went out of, they closed it in the mid-90s, I believe it was. So what they found in their statistics is that 75% of the females that went into that program had been sexually assaulted. So basically that goes along with the statistics that I just showed you, which again are 10 years out of date, but probably the conditions that supported that kind of stuff happening are still in existence. Do the majority of these women prefer to be counseled by a man or a woman? Now, what I'm pointing out to you as civilians is that the training system has identified the level of skill that any person needs to be able to address this issue if you're going to seek out a counselor. So theoretically, even though the client preference might be for the same gender as them, a person of either skill level or either gender or gender expression could successfully treat someone, right? Another question I have is individuals with ADHD that are prescribed amphetamines, do they become addicted, or do people with ADHD feel normal when taking these type of drugs? So, an answer. The professional standard is this: wherever possible, match a counselor to the client. So where similarities exist and the client feels safe, try and match. Obviously, women counselors with sexual abuse experience match with women who've been sexually abused would be the optimal match, but that doesn't always happen. And there are some women who say, well, I would prefer a man because I'm more able to game a woman than a man, or vice versa. You could also say that women prefer male counselors because they can game them, male, you have all kinds of dynamics within that, and theoretically people's training should allow them to compensate for that. But that doesn't always happen. Some clients, I've had actually women clients, the majority of my clients actually are women because the majority of students here are women. They preferred male counselors. Sometimes they feel they can manipulate them, but for whatever reason they feel safer or less judged by a man than with women. Whatever characteristics of the client or the counselor, gay, straight, recovering, of color, poor, disabled, the counselor has to be competent to understand and ask the right questions and know what direction to point the client in, whether the client is aware of the issues or not, and whether the client actually believes there are issues or not. So I've had women clients who went through women's treatment and whose addiction was driven by their sexual abuse and sexual assault by well-to-do family members, and these issues weren't raised in treatment until they came to see me. So, was the client, and the client said, well, I was in denial and I didn't want to talk about it. So they did ask, but they didn't necessarily probe. So whether the client believes there are issues or not is the counselor's responsibility to probe, to find out whether there are issues. So by telling you this, what I'm essentially trying to get you to do is understand that there are issues, and it is also more powerful for you to be aware of them and to raise them with a counselor. Okay? The counselor is actually supposed to know this regardless of whether they have those particular characteristics, that is, whether they're gay, straight, of color, or not. So knowing that statistic, which is drawn from SHARP, Sacred Heart Adolescent Recovery Program, in the late 80s and early 90s, I can ask the question of a woman: have you ever been sexually abused, assaulted, or have periods of time from your childhood that you don't remember, or have traumatic flashbacks during sex? And if a man can ask these questions appropriately, with the right timing, the right tone of voice, then sure, they can also do the job. So I'm saying you have to be, you don't have to be trained, but it helps to be trained, or you can train yourself to take on all comers competently. So professionally, and this is true both for you as civilians, you might actually have to deal with somebody that you don't like. So especially if you know, for example, if you're on parole or probation and you have to deal with your probation officer and they don't get along with you, or there's a personality conflict, or there's definitely a power relationship. Well, part of that is learning how to deal with those kind of relationships so that you transition successfully. Okay? You still have to deliver the best service you know how as a professional, and as a client, potential client, you also want to have the best outcome for you as well in terms of dealing with certain people. So a thought experiment. Could you raise, for those of you who are parents or going to be parents, could you raise the child of your worst enemy the way that person would want their child raised? And I don't mean hating you, I mean optimally. Okay? Not to hate you, but to achieve their own version of happiness and fulfillment as if it were your child. Now, the reason I'm bringing up a child is not that a counselor and a client is in a parent-child relationship. That's actually a bad boundary we call transference and counter-transference. But the reason we use the term counselor basically asks questions and advises. A client is in a relationship where you're trying to act in the best interest of the client and or the larger society. So as potential clients, some of you may be training to be counselors, you also want to be aware of that relationship and understand what's optimal for you and be able to advocate for it. So, if you didn't know how to raise that person's child, your enemy's child, how would you find out? Could you make friends with members of their community? Could you love your enemy? Could you sustain your effort? Now, that's why I started talking about in the beginning about philosophy. Now, this may sound like philosophy, but what I'm basically trying to impart to you is basically the skills necessary to be able to ask and answer certain hard questions that could be at the heart of your addictive process. And I'm assuming if you're living in America that you have some kind of addictive process, because that's what America does, right? So it's not just that can you quit, but can you sustain your quit even through persistent thoughts? And persistent thoughts we call cravings, because all cravings is persistent thought. I want it. I want it. I want it. Gotta have it. I want it. I want it. I want it. And so part of the idea of giving you breath work in the beginning is to begin to learn the skill of interrupting or calming some of those I want it, I want it, I want it type of thoughts. Okay? So sustainability is a thing that is often thrown around, and the college has a focus on it, and infusing that concept into addiction class, or introduction to addiction class. So sustainability is essentially the new name for an ancient concept which ultimately derives from the conviction that your daily actions affect the world and the future. So you should act as if you are connected and that your actions will affect the seventh generation away from you. Now, there's even a brand called Seventh Generation. They make paper products and household cleaning products that are biodegradable. And this comes from Iroquois Six Nations, which basically it's the English translation of these treaties that basically said, okay, we hold this agreement and to the seventh generation, which actually, the treaties with the United States were made with the specific language of as long as the grass grows and the river flows. But part of their decision-making process was basically believing, okay, we don't own the land. The land is actually the unborn children's land. That is the seventh generation away from us. So sustainability, basically 3 circles: social, economic, and environmental. And then where they intersect is essentially, can the environment, so for example, starting with social, everything, the environment supports everything. And so in terms of a society, can the environment bear, so is it bearable? Is it sustainable? Is it equitable in terms of economics? Is it viable in terms of economics? So economics is the science of distribution of what is necessary for life. So it's not just money, it's also information, it's also skills, it's also resources. Equitable means equal. So within these 3 domains, social, environmental, and economic, where they intersect is basically in this diagram of sustainability. This is where you want a balance between all of those things. Okay, society lives in a way, in sustainability, society lives in a way that the economy, that is the exchange of goods, services, and information, okay, the economy, exchange of goods, services, and information, does not destroy or damage the environment. That it sustains, gives back what it takes, and enriches the environment, which isn't just the physical environment, but also the non-physical environment. So, as an example, does it make, in the days where we lived by rivers and we depended on the river for drinking water, it makes it incumbent upon those who live upstream not to pee or poop in other people's drinking water. So in fact, the camping protocol where you basically do your business peeing or pooping 200 feet away from a stream so that you don't contaminate it. You bury dead bodies 6 feet underground so that they can biodegrade, but also not be exposed to animals, but also not necessarily pollute your drinking water. Your drinking water, coming from wells that go down 1,000 feet, so you go into the aquifer and not in surface water, so the water that you get is pure. So society lives in a way that the economy does not destroy or damage the environment. So within Iroquois Six Nations, in terms of the 7th generation, when they made longhouses, they did not clear cut a forest to make a longhouse, because they understood the forest has to be there for generations to come, at least 140 years, assuming a generation is 20 years each. So society lives in a way that is sustainable. So the environment sustains and supports society and the economy. You have to have the environment, and it has to be the environment is a living system. The environment supports society, and it also supports the economy. When any of those start getting out of balance, where the economy starts getting so that, we're going to clear cut this forest, we're going to move coal trains through your neighborhood, we're going to do this particular practice that pollutes the water, air, and soil, then we're living in a situation that's not sustainable. One of our challenges, and one of there is a movie that actually adequately explains this that sometimes we show. In this particular show, we're not going to talk about it, but the movie is called The Story of Stuff. And it's free and it's online, and you can just Google The Story of Stuff and you can watch the movie yourself. And talks about how our society kind of is built on a non-sustainable model where the economy is basically overcoming the environment and destroying the ability of the environment to produce things that will support society. And there are lots of ways, climate change has to do with this, ocean acidification has to do with this. So the environment supports it all. So you cannot consume more than what's there in the environment. If you do, the economy and eventually society collapses. And we've actually seen this in ancient cultures, even on this continent, not just the natives that were eradicated by the forces of Western civilization, but that they had abandoned whole cities and towns because the water dried up. That's one of the things that's going on in Syria, for example, today, or Somalia. So I was watching a trailer for that movie Captain Phillips, which is in which an American freighter is taken over by Somali pirates. Well, Somalis are fishermen, many of them. And so one of the things that happened when their government collapsed, so you need a government to patrol the oceans. Your government has to have a navy. So if the economy collapses, then you can't pay your sailors to patrol the oceans. What that means is that other people come in and start fishing in your waters and you can't stop them because you need a navy to stop people from overfishing in your waters. So that's essentially what happened to Somalia. So when that state collapsed and other nations started overfishing in Somali waters, basically people who were fishermen were forced to basically do piracy on the land and on the ocean. I mean, imagine, what would drive you to be desperate enough to try and capture a freighter from a little motorboat, even if you have a bunch of rifles, and hold them for ransom? That's not sustainable. It's not going to work. There are some people that are going to fight back. We also see that kind of with Syria and also Iran, where because of climate change, the water table has dropped so that farmers can't sustain their crops. This is actually a contingency thought of by the Pentagon as they recognize that a government can only exist if it feeds its people and if the people are fed. If the people are not fed, then they're going to revolt one way or the other if we can't provide basic services. So this is one of the things that's happening in Syria. It's also happening on the Iranian plateau. We're seeing floods here in America and droughts here in America from climate change. So it is, the environment does support it all, and this is a consideration. Now, where I was going with this and how this, relates to an addictions class is the economy is not just money. In addiction, the economy acts as if it can grow regardless of what happens or its effects on society or the environment. Okay? Now, I'm not just talking about drug addiction, but with drug addiction, this is an excellent example of what happens. Okay? Addicts or drug producers act regardless of their effect on society and the environment. So whether you're making meth, which is highly toxic, or whether you're a cartel, sponsored marijuana grow and you're using chemicals and rat poison and all these other kind of things that are environmentally toxic, you're doing that to produce a crop for sale without necessarily caring about what it's doing to your neighbors or the environment. What are the consequences, the unintended consequences of poisoning rats, and then also poisoning the birds that feed on those rats or other animals that might feed on carcasses, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So addicts and producers act regardless of their effect on society and the environment. They're disconnected from the whole. Okay? Or they act as if they're disconnected. So a question a person asked, where do you see society going? The answer is not to hell in a handbasket, because I don't necessarily believe in hell or devil, though there is evil, and certainly global warming or climate change will cause parts of the earth to resemble hell, like Sydney or Los Angeles. So my answer, beyond the Einstein quote that I will show you, that I actually showed you last time, is acting towards balance and teaching balance. No matter what happens, even if the world is destroyed, I will endure. This is the Bodhisattva vow as conceived by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who came here earlier this year. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, may I too abide to dispel the miseries of this suffering world. The original one, life is suffering. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them all. So, internal balance. Like bicycling develops the physical skill of balance while moving through different terrain and climate. Okay, so notice, those of you who ride a bicycle, you probably don't ride a bicycle with training wheels. And what training wheels were there to develop was an internal sense of balance. And once you got it, you got it. You never had to relearn that skill again. Once you learn the bicycle, it stays with you forever, as they say. So internal balance is a skill that is underdeveloped in addiction. So that's why we talk about it. Okay? Breath awareness is one of the first skills in terms of looking at internal balance. It develops the skill of internal balance of the mind and emotions while moving through different grounds of being. Okay? Or emotional quicksand. So sometimes when people feel overwhelmed, like to use this example because I like the idea of swimming in the ocean, swimming and surfing, or surfing. There's a big wave coming. How do you handle that big wave? Or quicksand. Quicksand is basically like sand with a lot of water, so the sand is essentially suspended in the water, and if you try and swim through it, it pulls you under. But if you float on your back, then you can actually survive in quicksand enough to be able to get to more solid ground. But that means you kind of have to have the skill of being comfortable floating on your back, being somewhat vulnerable, and getting to the shore, to solid ground, and having the patience to do that, rather than try to freestyle, which will cause you to die in quicksand. Okay, so what are the techniques for swimming in quicksand? Both physical quicksand and also emotional quicksand. Walking on water, going through the mud and murky water, that's water. So within an addictions context, we see part of the response, that is the community response to the problem of addiction, being one of at least 3 things that have survived the test of time. 12-step, evidence-based practice, that's what EBP means, evidence-based practice, and community-defined evidence. So understand, within 12-step, since 12-step is a meme, if you will, a construct that's been going since the early to mid 20th century, it basically happened before much of the science of addiction was developed, and it basically was a community of sufferers, that is, people who suffered from alcoholism and then drug addiction, and basically just banded together for mutual support and came up with their own internal rules and spread essentially like virally, if you will, like a global global practice. And so it's recognized in lots of different countries internationally. And over 90% of many of the treatment programs within the United States are based around some principle of the 12-step model. Now, the challenge with 12-step practices is that they're not necessarily based on scientific evidence. Because, for example, if they rely on a higher power, which even though they say that it is not religious, the scientist crowd doesn't really like the idea of, okay, you need a higher power to successfully deal with this disease. How much higher power can you put in a bottle? Or how much higher power fits into this pill? What is this higher power? So they actually like evidence-based practices, which essentially means, okay, is this scientifically valid? Can we prove that this behavior leads to this outcome? And repeating this behavior leads to this outcome. And can we scientifically prove it? And can that evidence be replicated so that we can say that it's a scientific fact? That's what evidence-based practice means. Now, that's not a bad philosophy in terms of looking at, oh, do things work? But evidence-based practice means that it has to have been studied by a government or a university somewhere that you consider valid. Do governments and universities study everything that humans do? No, they do not. Do they study things that are in isolated communities? Not always. So in terms of community-defined evidence, there are certain communities that have been subject to addiction that have basically developed their own modes of dealing with the problem of addiction and incorporated those modes as part of their culture. So part of one of the things I'm saying is that their cultures, recovery cultures older than 12-step. It's just that in our society, in the English-speaking world in America, 12-step has name familiarity. That is, it's when people think of recovery, they most often think of a 12-step, the 12 steps of AA or NA or all the other anonymous style addictions type programs. And they might not necessarily think of the Wellbriety movement, which comes out of Native American communities, or the Nation of Islam, which comes out of African American communities, or there are other examples of non-12-step recovery programs. So community-defined evidence, CDE. So communities basically do their own research, their own practice, and incorporate it as part of their culture. All right? So one question in terms of testing the efficacy of these. Do you scratch the itch of addiction yourself personally in terms of not developing inner balance, or do you soothe the skin of the emotions with breaths lotion? Not to be too poetic, but the idea of developing the skill of internal balance is common to all three of these modes: 12-step, evidence-based practice, and community-defined evidence. So what the solution to the problem is depends on who's asking the question and what their view of the problem is. So as an example, there is a word which is called enantiodromia. And let's find a better pen. Enantiodromia. And enantiodromia is a long Greek word which means that which arises from its opposite. And essentially it means three things beyond the literal meaning. That which arises from its opposite. Problems. So one, problems create solutions. Two, solutions create new problems. Okay? You could also think of this as disease. From the disease arises the cure. But then the cure creates new disease. Okay? So we definitely see this in terms of, for example, epidemiology. So the widespread use of antibiotics once we started learning to use antibiotics. So as an example, the Egyptians and the Chinese 5,000 years ago both cultivated bread mold for penicillin. Penicillin was then rediscovered in the early 20th century and distilled from bread mold. So we started using it for everything. Now, what happens is that penicillin kills the bugs that are resistant to penicillin, but it doesn't kill all the bugs. And what happens if you don't, for example, if you're prescribed an antibiotic, you're supposed to continue taking the antibiotic till the prescription's out. But usually people will just take it until the symptoms disappear. So what happens is you kill some of the bugs, so the disease and the cure, and then the cure creates new disease, that is drug-resistant, we'll name the condition. So for example, MRSA is a staph infection that is resistant to broad spectrum of antibiotics. These diseases have arisen because of our widespread use of antibiotics, particularly in the food supply, i.e. chicken, and the way chickens have been raised. So when we talk about sustainability, right, if you have a chicken that was designed to live in a jungle originally, and you cage it, and you keep pumping it full of antibiotics because it can't move around in the cage and it's laying eggs and you're fattening it up and giving it hormones, and they die of diseases and you still slaughter them, and then the antibiotics get into human food supply, then basically creating a resistance to antibiotics, and you've now generated a new problem. So in enantiodromia, that which arises from its opposite, problems create solutions, solutions create new problems, and then a third, the way you see the problem is the problem. So sometimes, basically, it's the way you see the problem that's the problem. So back to slide, if you would. So, the solution to addiction depends on who's asking the question and what their view of the problem is. So I teach and identify 5 ways of seeing the addiction problem. Now, before 1956, addiction was basically viewed as a sin. That is, policy-wise, willful misbehavior. Right? You know what's right, you're doing wrong, and you decided to do wrong. So that's a sin. So this is obviously popular with church people, religious organizations, and also law enforcement, as an example. So then if addiction is sin, then the solution is, well, jail them. Is addiction a disease? Well, if it's a disease, well, then you cure it, you treat it. Well, what's the treatment? Well, 12-step based treatment seems to be the mode of choice. But there are some problems with that, certainly within the scientific and medical community, because there are certain things that are very prevalent, memes within 12-step culture that are not scientifically proven, or actually that are counter to scientific proof, or are scientifically imprecise, and then lead to other problems. So they think addiction, so within the scientific community, addiction is a maladaptive behavior. That is a bad adaptation. So essentially, if this actually were to show up on a midterm or final near you, basically, when addiction is a maladaptive behavior, you're basically using bad coping skills. And it's not that society taught you coping skills, but that's what essentially happened. Bad coping skills, and so what we need to do then is teach you better coping skills. Is addiction koyaanisqatsi, which you can see is a non-English word. It's a Hopi word which has 13 different translations into English, the most popular being life out of balance, or life that calls out for another way of living, a better way of living, or crazy life. And is addiction slavery? So addiction as koyaanisqatsi came out of a Native American worldview. Addiction as slavery came out of an African American worldview. The first other three were basically policy that came out of mainstream America and the scientific community. Addiction is sin, addiction is disease, addiction is maladaptive behavior. And that's the standard three that drug counselors are trained on. So I'm giving them to you as civilians to understand, when you've had these problems and then you've approached these particular folks with that problem, or you've been confronted with your particular use, the response of the law enforcement community is to put you in jail, not necessarily give you treatment. The treatment of a person in the addictions field within the 12-step community is, as long as you conform to 12-step style values, then you can be successful in treatment. In maladaptive behavior, well, you need to basically do pro-social, healthy coping skill methods and methodologies, and you'll be cured, as it were. In addiction as koyaanisqatsi, well, you're living a crazy life because of being exposed to this society. So you need to return to a more balanced cultural pattern. And in addiction is slavery. You were put in chains. You need to free yourself. And here's how you do that. So what the solution is depends on who's asking the question. And we're looking at this as in terms of how old this is as a policy. So if addiction is sin, the solution is punishment and incarceration. That's basically a 500-year-old policy. If addiction is disease, then that was actually the policy of the United States up until really 1956, though it is still kind of popular today, if you notice. If addiction is a disease, then the solution is 12-step based treatment. And that's about 57 to 70 years old, dating back to 1956 when the AMA, American Medical Association, declared that alcoholism was a disease. If addiction is a maladaptive behavior, then the solution is evidence-based practice, that is Western scientific research, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which teaches you to see your behavior as self-medication and teaches you skills or gives you pills. And that practice is less than 57 years old. So, very complicated example of kind of what's being done. These are the standard modus operandi for addiction in terms of, so if you've seen these particular things, or if you've been exposed to motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy in certain systems, then this is why you have, because of the policy. This is the answer, society's particular answer to this particular problem. So as an example of the third one, this graphic, which I usually use in the professional course because of the level of language used, those of you who worship the tobacco god, this slide basically represents acetylcholine transmission. And while I am getting ahead of myself, I'm just letting you know, I'm just showing you this as an example, not to confuse you with the science. So this is a computer simulation of what happens when you smoke a cigarette and why cigarettes work. Cigarettes work along a particular neurotransmitter pathway called acetylcholine. All choline neurotransmitters have to do with nerves and muscles. And so this is a graphic that came from the pharmacology department in UCSD in San Diego, University of California at San Diego. Our laboratory is interested in the structure and function of enzymes and receptors involved in neurotransmission. In particular, we have been studying functional coupling of receptors to cellular responses, specificity of ligand recognition by acetylcholine receptors and acetylcholinesterase, and the structures of cholinesterases and nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. A second area of investigation involves a regulation of expression of the genes encoding these proteins during differentiation and synaptogenesis in neurons and skeletal muscles. And I'm sure by now you're saying, English, English. Well, that is English. Okay, it's scientific English. So, here's what they're saying line by line. So their laboratory is studying the structure and function of enzymes and receptors involved in neurotransmission. So the whole discovery of neurotransmitters, that there are 85 plus different chemicals manufactured in your body, which we used to think in the time of this neurotransmission that it was only in the nerves, but we found that it's elsewhere too. So neurotransmission. In particular, they've been studying functional coupling of receptors to cellular responses. Okay, so what happens when you introduce these substances to particular cells? What do the cells do? Specificity of ligand recognition by acetylcholine receptors. So they're looking at a particular neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and everywhere that it's active, and in this particular case, acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, is turned off by a specific enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. That's actually how you can tell, because it ends in ASE, esterase. And the structures of cholinesterases, so that's other enzymes that work with other types of choline other than acetylcholine. How do we tell the difference? How does the receptor know the difference between these two different chemicals? And the structures of cholinesterases and nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So the working theory about why nicotine is so addictive is because it matches these acetylcholine receptors and it stimulates them. And so if you don't have stimulation, you go into withdrawal. So they also want to know as second area, so that's the broad first area. All these different chemicals, where are they active, what turns them on, what turns them off. A second area investigation involves the regulation of expression of the genes encoding these proteins during differentiation and synaptogenesis in neurons and skeletal muscles. So what they're looking for is that all of us started by uniting sperm and an egg. And then the sperm and egg become one cell, and then that cell starts dividing. They want to know at what point in differentiation, that is, when different cells that were one cell, then multiple cells, at what point does a skeletal muscle cell start to form, a nerve cell start to form, a muscle cell start to form, and at what point does this encoding begin so that all these different structures can recognize that particular neurotransmitter? So that's essentially what they're looking at. So differentiation, cells becoming different tissues and different structures, and synaptogenesis, that is, where does the synapse begin in the nervous system and the interface between the neurons and skeletal muscles. So all that to say, and this is from Wikipedia just to basically explain some of the different concepts there. I'm not going to go through all of it. Okay, so I'm not throwing this at you to confuse you, but just to show you how intricate the science is. Okay, the science alone doesn't give you a personal solution unless you understand it, and not necessarily, maybe not even then, because certainly we have doctors, lawyers, all kinds of professionals who can understand addictive processes, but just be caught unawares. Just like I was telling you last week about the city prosecutor who was drunk driving. The guy who prosecutes drunk drivers, you would think would know not to do certain behavior and get caught. You would think that, but something else was happening. And this is actually typical. So the science doesn't teach you how to deal with your nicotine cravings during your quit phases. Knowing that's science. It doesn't teach you that. Okay? Since the focus at your level, the civilian level, on lifestyle changes based on simple formula. If you want to know this, do this. If this happens, do this. This is an example of what I refer to as a strategy mean. If you want to know this, do this. If this happens, do this. If something else happens, do that. Okay, so if addiction is koyaanisqatsi, life out of balance, then the solution is restoring or creating a new balance. Okay, this is a 4,000 plus year old community-defined evidence pre-contact cultural tradition based in many native communities that had, before contact, an extensive 800 different plant-based and formulation of pharmacology, of which we have 80 or 90 just from Native Americans alone, as I've said before. So it comes out of a culture of tradition, and some of that knowledge still exists, and a lot of it has been altered or destroyed or co-opted. So this is what I mean by community-defined evidence. So not all knowledge is in Western civilization or Western-based science. So if addiction is slavery, then the solution is liberation through self-knowledge and accessing what was referred to in this world, that worldview, as the amenta. What the amenta is in this framework that is in dynastic Egypt or Kemet, that in that community-defined evidence, every human being has the wisdom of the universe inside them. And that collection of universal wisdom within you is called the amenta. And so everybody has it. All human beings have an amenta. But education is basically the process of teaching you how to access that. So in this view of addiction, you have already the ability to recover from an addictive process. All we have to do is show you that you are already in balance and teach you to return to that balance. And once you're in that balance, then there are certain activities that flow from that realization. But first you have to understand that, you're potentially a target, you're potentially enslaved. Before you can get free, you have to free your mind to be able to do that. So, hence, from this tradition, mind follows breath. Various religions, spiritual disciplines, creative and martial arts notes there's a relationship between your mood and your breathing. Most often, we've been domesticated to rely on external sources for our mood. So food affects mood, and we acknowledge this through the term comfort food. In fact, the rap group Dead Prez basically says, yeah, food is the last plantation that us slaves need to free ourselves from. Okay? So food, alcohol and television, pharmaceutical drugs, street drugs, church, dancing, music are all used to affect mood. They all have an effect on how you breathe. Many of them can be addictive processes too. So, in addition, you put the control outside of you, outside of yourself. What we call natural mind develops the conscious internal controls. Okay? Feed yourself food for thought instead of actual food. Certainly don't neglect your nutrition, but try and consume food for thought, because there's an Ethiopian proverb that says, the seeker of drunkenness will one day have enough. The seeker of knowledge will never have enough. So mind follows breath. Natural mind develops the conscious internal controls. So I'm not suggesting you throw away your medications and simply breathe. I'm saying you have to breathe anyway. The breath is free today anyway, and you might as well breathe consciously, because conscious attention to the breath is an effective practice in a number of areas and basically moves across all those different modes of addiction and addiction responses that I showed you. So you can either do mind or mood altering chemicals, or mind or mood altering practices. And so what we're going to move into next week is actually looking at neurotransmission for beginners. But I'll end with this: the fourfold human self: mind, spirit, body, and emotions. Borrowing construct from Native Americans. They're actually one, but we divide them to talk about them. Breath technique affects all aspects simultaneously. Healthy culture would have taught you to do this in the time you were taught basic hygiene. And this is mental, emotional hygiene. So use your words, we tell 2-year-olds, and we tell you, watch your breath. Instead, the focus on the breath in America is on how your mouth smells to others, but watch your breathing. So, till then, we will see you next week. Go in peace.
Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.